The notification chime on Olis V's terminal did not just ring. It shrieked like a dying starship engine. As the safety supervisor of Transit Station Aster 9, Olis was accustomed to alarms. Aster 9 was a spinning metal monstrosity perched on the edge of the charted sectors, currently undergoing a frantic, station-wide polish to host the upcoming Intergalactic Trade Conference. The air recyclers smelled strongly of industrial ozone and panicked sweat. For the last 48 hours, Olis had survived entirely on synthesized caffeine and pure, unadulterated spite. She stared at the flashing red priority banner on her screen. It was not a hull breach. It was not a reactor fluctuation. It was an administrative complaint package. But the system had flagged it as a Class A emergency. "NATO!" Olis called out, rubbing the bridge of her nose where a persistent headache had set up permanent residence. Her voice was raspy, dry as orbital dust. "Tell me the atmospheric scrubbers in Sector 4 have failed again. Tell me a rogue asteroid is going to obliterate the promenade. Give me good news." Her assistant, NATO Rill, scurried into the cramped office. NATO was a slender, multi-limbed species whose skin flushed pale blue when he was stressed. Right now, he was practically glowing like a distress beacon. He clutched a stack of physical data slates to his chest as if they were live explosives. "Supervisor Vey," NATO squeaked, his vocal translators struggling to keep up with his rapid clicking mandibles. "It is not the scrubbers. We have received a joint formal grievance, a priority override grievance." Olis sighed, leaning back in her ergonomically disastrous chair. "From whom? The Valaris merchants complaining about the humidity again?" "No, Supervisor," NATO said, dropping the data slates onto her cluttered desk. They hit the metal surface with a heavy, ominous thud. "From 7 different species." Simultaneously, Olis froze. Her hand hovered over her half-empty mug. 7? Which 7? The Croth, the Cillian Scholar Delegation, the OSC. NATO rattled off the list. Olis stopped listening after the first 2. The Croth were hulking, reptilian warlords who respected nothing but blunt force trauma. The Cillians were fragile, crystalline pacifists who communicated in theoretical mathematics. If a Croth and a Cillian were in the same room, the statistical probability of a murder was near 100%. "They filed a joint complaint?" Olis asked, the absurdity of the situation piercing through her exhaustion. "Did they accidentally bump into each other and decide to sue the station?" "It is not a joint filing in the traditional sense, ma'am," NATO corrected, his lower set of hands nervously adjusting his uniform collar. "They filed 7 separate complaints within 19 seconds of each other. But the contents, Supervisor, the contents are identical, down to the exact punctuation." Olis snatched the top slate. The glowing text translated instantly into standard galactic common. She read the bolded subject line out loud. "Formal grievance regarding the demonstration of illegal biological capabilities and the infliction of collective psychological trauma." She blinked. She read it again. "Psychological trauma? Since when do the Croth care about psychological trauma?" "Since about 40 minutes ago, apparently," NATO muttered. Olis scanned the rest of the document. The complaint detailed an incident in the heavy-duty physical conditioning ring, specifically the high-stress corridor calibrated to 5 times standard planetary gravity. According to the text, a single organic being had entered the corridor and engaged in what the document called a terrifying and physics-defying display of sustained kinetic motion. "Who is the subject of the complaint?" "NATO," Olis asked, though she already felt a sickening knot forming in her stomach. She knew the answer. She just needed to hear it. NATO swallowed hard, the blue flush on his skin deepening. "It is a human, Supervisor, from the Earth Diplomatic Mission's technical staff, Lieutenant Danica Rowe." Olis dropped her head onto the desk with a solid thunk. The metal felt wonderfully cool against her forehead. Humans, she groaned into the desk. Why is it always humans? For the past 3 months. Ever since the Earth delegation arrived early to set up their communications arrays for the trade conference. Aster 9 had been plagued by bizarre anomalies. A human engineer had jury-rigged a plasma conduit with metallic tape and a chewing substance, somehow increasing efficiency by 12% while voiding 3 centuries of safety regulations. Another human had engaged a notoriously aggressive apex predator in the xenobiology lab in a staring contest, and won. Whenever the station's delicate, carefully curated balance tipped into chaos, Ollis invariably found a squishy, unarmored primate at the center of the disaster. But this was different. Ollis lifted her head, her managerial instincts finally overriding her fatigue. She tapped the second slate, then the third. She cross-referenced the Kroth warrior's statement with the Cillian scholar's addendum. "Look at this," Ollis said, her tone sharpening. "This is not just a noise complaint, this is organized panic." She read from the Kroth document. The warrior, Commander Varric Tharn, states that witnessing the human propel her frail calcium-based frame through the crushing pressure of the 5th gravity tier has caused him to deeply question the muscular honor foundation of his ancestors. NATO. A Kroth just admitted to an existential crisis caused by a human going for a jog. NATO nodded rapidly. And the Cillian delegation is demanding a full security lockdown of the entire training sector. They are officially claiming that the human's actions are a manifestation of classified military cybernetic implants that violate the Orion Accords. Ollis stood up and began pacing the narrow confines of her office. The air felt suddenly thicker. The office comedy she thought she was dealing with had just evaporated. 7 species, who historically could not agree on the color of empty space, had just submitted a meticulously synchronized, perfectly translated template of terror. They were not angry. They were terrified. And they were using bureaucratic red tape to build a wall between themselves and a single human technician. "This makes no sense," Ollis muttered, tapping her chin. "A human body under 5 times normal gravity should suffer massive internal hemorrhaging, bone microfractures, and immediate cardiovascular collapse within minutes. Even if she survived, she would be crawling, not running. And even if she was running, why would these 7 specific individuals care enough to coordinate a diplomatic incident?" "Perhaps it is exactly as they say," NATO offered weakly. "Perhaps she is a cyborg." "The Earth delegation was scanned at customs," Ollis countered. "Standard biometric sweeps. Unless Earth has invented stealth metal that evades our deep resonance scanners. Lieutenant Danica Rowe is entirely flesh, blood, and bone." Ollis returned to her desk and pulled up the primary terminal interface. "Bring up the security feed from the heavy conditioning ring. Timestamp 45 minutes ago. I want to see what actually happened. I want to see this illegal biological capability with my own eyes." She expected to see a glitch. She expected to see a human acting foolishly, perhaps staggering into the wrong corridor by mistake, waving her arms in panic before hitting the emergency abort button. She wanted to process this as a foolish prank, penalize the Earth delegation a few thousand credits, and go back to worrying about the atmospheric scrubbers. The screen flickered to life. The overhead camera displayed the sterile, heavily reinforced entrance to the high-gravity corridor. The ambient lighting was a harsh, warning yellow, indicating that the artificial gravity plating was active and lethal. The heavy blast doors hissed open. Lieutenant Danica Rowe stepped onto the screen. Ollis leaned closer, her breath catching in her throat. The very first second of the footage completely dismantled her expectations. Danica was not wearing a pressurized exosuit. She was not wearing a localized anti-gravity harness. She wore simple, dark athletic fabric, shorts, a tight, sweat-wicking top, and worn-out, soft-soled shoes that offered absolutely zero mechanical support. She looked incredibly small against the massive, heavily shielded bulkheads of the training ring. But it was not her attire that sent a cold spike of unease down Olis's spine. It was her demeanor. Danica did not look like someone who had wandered in by mistake. She did not look like a thrill-seeker looking for a dangerous rush. Her face, visible in high resolution on the monitor, was locked in an expression of chilling, absolute focus. Her eyes were sharp, scanning the structural seams of the corridor, not the exercise equipment. She stepped past the warning threshold. The indicator lights flashed from yellow to deep red, confirming that the chamber was holding at 5 times the standard gravitational constant. A weight that should have driven her to her knees instantly. Instead, Danica simply adjusted her shoulders, planted her feet with deliberate precision, and rolled her neck. She stood perfectly upright, bearing the crushing, invisible weight, as if it were nothing more than a heavy coat. She looked exactly like a woman who had walked into the exact place she needed to be, fully prepared for whatever was waiting in the dark. Olis stared at the telemetry overlay, pulsing in the top corner of the security footage. The digital readout glared in a toxic, luminescent orange, displaying numbers that made the safety supervisor's stomach churn. The environmental metrics climbed with a sickening, steady rhythm. 4.8, 4.9, 5.0, but it did not stop there. The station's internal dampeners groaned, a deep acoustic hum captured by the audio feed, as the artificial gravity fluctuated, peaking at a brutal 5.4 gravities before settling back to a flat 5. For the vast majority of Aster 9's residents, that number was not a rigorous workout setting. It was a red alert threshold, a catastrophic environmental failure where internal organs liquefied, ocular fluid ruptured, and spinal columns collapsed under their own sudden weight. At 5 gravities, a standard human weighing 150 pounds would suddenly be forced to carry 750 pounds of downward force. Yet, the human on the screen did not immediately launch into a reckless sprint. Olis had braced herself for the foolish arrogance of a fragile species showing off. Perhaps a sudden burst of speed, followed by a horrifying collapse. Instead, Danica Rowe performed a meticulous, agonizingly precise warm-up. It was a ritual. Every joint articulation was deliberate and calculated. She stretched her hamstrings, locked her core, and adjusted her breathing into a harsh, rhythmic hiss that cut through the ambient hum of the gravity generators. Her muscles compressed visibly beneath her pale skin, fighting the invisible titan pressing down on her shoulders. But her skeletal alignment remained utterly flawless. She moved like a veteran structural engineer who had danced with bone-crushing pressure hundreds of times before and knew exactly how to respect the lethal physics of the room. Then, she began to run. The first stride was heavy. Her soft-soled shoe struck the reinforced decking with the concussive impact of an industrial drop hammer. The second stride found the rhythm. By the third step, Olis leaned so far forward, her chest pressed against her desk, her breath hitching in her throat. Danica was not just enduring the run. She was executing a highly specific pattern. It was an arduous, pounding jog, but with a bizarre, methodical addition. Every third step, the human reached out her right hand and slapped the reinforced metal bulkhead. Left, right, touch, left, right, touch. Her palm struck the metal exactly over the primary load-bearing seams of the corridor. She was not stumbling. She was not seeking balance from the wall. Her fingers spread wide upon impact, lingering for a microsecond longer than necessary, as if she were reading a braille of structural stress. She was tracking an invisible chain of telemetry, feeling for harmonic resonance and micro-vibrations that only an organic body under immense physical strain could detect. The anomaly of her presence did not go unnoticed. The security feed possessed a secondary camera angle, showing the standard conditioning zone separated from the extreme gravity corridor by a wall of heavy polyglass. A crowd had formed. Olis watched as a heavily muscled Volaris merchant simply let go of a pair of massive kinetic dumbbells. The iron hit the floor with a silent, Heavy crash. Completely ignored by the stunned alien. A minor ambassador from the lower transit rings, a species known for their delicate pneumatic biology, folded at the knees and fainted dead away. Their nervous system completely overloaded just by proxy. A few paces away, a reptilian trainee slumped against the glass, openly weeping. To the varied species of the station, the human was a soft, fleshy anomaly. A creature made of water and fragile calcium that was aggressively conquering the fundamental laws of nature. They were watching a ghost walk through a solid wall, and their minds could not process the visual data. But Olis was trained to see beyond the spectacle of the crowd. She tracked Danika's eyes. A show-off would look at the audience. A braggart would check the reflection in the glass to admire the shock and awe of the aliens gathered outside. Danika's gaze never once drifted to the observation deck. Her eyes were locked onto the floor grates, sweeping over the ventilation shafts, narrowing at the vibration nodes embedded in the titanium walls. Her face was a mask of cold, analytical dread. She was totally consumed by the physical environment of the corridor itself, calculating the return force of every footfall. The ordeal lasted for nearly 40 minutes. When Danika finally decelerated, bringing her heavy, pounding strides to a halt, her chest was heaving. Her dark athletic uniform was soaked through, and the capillaries in her arms and face were flushed a deep crimson from extreme cardiovascular exertion. A normal being, assuming they possessed the miraculous biology to survive such a feat, would have immediately dragged themselves toward the nearest decompression lock to escape the crushing weight. Danika did not leave. She dropped to her knees, right in the center of the high-gravity zone. She placed both palms flat against the cold metal plating, closed her eyes, and lowered her head, pressing her ear near the deck. She stayed there, completely motionless, listening to the deep, resonant vibrations echoing up from the station's massive, skeletal spine. Rising slowly, moving with the heavy, calculated grace of a deep-sea diver, operating under immense pressure. Danika walked over to the technical interface panel near the exit doors. With quick, practiced keystrokes, she summoned a holographic maintenance warning tag, typed in a brief code, and locked it into the sector's local directory. Olis immediately split her terminal screen, pulling up the live maintenance ledger for the heavy conditioning ring. She searched for the warning tag the human had just filed. The directory was completely empty. The system showed no tag, no error report, no pending maintenance whatsoever. The digital footprint had been scrubbed the exact moment it was created. It was not a glitch. It was an active, immediate suppression by someone with higher administrative access than a safety supervisor. As Danika turned to exit the corridor, the security video violently sheared into static. Gray and white noise flooded the monitor for exactly 3 seconds. Olis checked the telemetry logs running parallel to the video feed. During those exact 3 seconds of visual blindness, the gravity index in the corridor had spiked erratically, an impossible anomaly that the system dampeners had failed to record as a mechanical error. The screen cleared. The heavy blast doors were closed. Danika was gone. The empty corridor hummed under the yellow warning lights, revealing nothing but the scuff marks of her shoes on the decking. Olis sat frozen in her chair, the cold glow of the monitor reflecting in her wide eyes. The profound irritation that had plagued her all morning vanished entirely, replaced by a deep, icy terror that settled into her bones. The administrative complaints were useless noise. The most disturbing element of the footage was not the impossible biology of a human running at 5 times standard gravity. The horrifying truth was etched into every calculated step the lieutenant had taken, every deliberate touch of the wall, and the erased maintenance log. Danika Rowe had not entered that corridor to exercise. She had not gone in to break a sweat or demonstrate her endurance to the galaxy. She had weaponized her own physical limits to perform a manual structural diagnostic. She was looking for something specific, something hidden deep within the station's architecture, and judging by the way she had listened to the floorboards, the human had found a disaster waiting to happen. Alice expected the human to walk into her office sweating, defensive, or perhaps aggressively citing diplomatic immunity. Instead, Lieutenant Danica Rowe strolled through the sliding doors, holding a thermal mug of something that smelled aggressively like roasted beans, looking no more stressed than a tourist asking for directions. She took the seat opposite the desk without being offered, crossed her legs, and took a slow sip. "Supervisor Vey," Danica said, her voice smooth and entirely devoid of the bureaucratic terror Olis usually commanded. "I was told there was a paperwork issue regarding my morning cardio." Olis pressed her palms flat against her desk, trying to project absolute, unyielding authority. She had spent the last hour preparing a standard disciplinary reprimand, a speech designed to crush the ego of reckless contractors. "Lieutenant Rowe, you triggered a Class A administrative nightmare. You manipulated the gravity dials to a lethal index and engaged in a highly irregular activity that caused widespread panic among the civilian populace." "Lethal is subjective," Danica replied, setting her mug down. "Earth sits at a much higher gravitational baseline than the standard ambient settings on this station. We evolved fighting a dense planetary pull just to stand upright. My skeleton is basically calcium and stubbornness. With the right high-altitude conditioning and a brutal training regimen, handling 5 times that force for a short duration is absolute hell on the knees. But it is not physically impossible." "You terrified 7 different delegations," Olis countered, her voice rising slightly. "They thought you were a banned cybernetic weapon." Danica let out a sharp, genuine laugh. "A weapon? Supervisor, if I wanted to put on a show and stroke my own ego, I would have dragged a shuttle engine across the main promenade at high noon. The heavy conditioning corridor is a sterile box, hidden in the basement levels. It is the most boring place on this spinning tin can. I did not go down there to flex for a bunch of tourists." Olis narrowed her eyes. The human's American pragmatism was completely derailing her interrogation strategy. She decided to drop the administrative hammer and pivot directly to the anomaly. "Then explain the telemetry. Explain why you were slapping the bulkhead every 3 strides. You were not balancing. You were measuring." The faint amusement vanished from Danica's face. The relaxed posture dissolved, replaced by the same chilling intensity Olis had witnessed on the security feed. The human leaned forward, resting her forearms on her knees. "I was tracking a ghost," Danica said softly. "When I was warming up, I felt a micro-tremor in the floor grates. It was barely there, a faint vibration that did not match the rotational spin of the station. So, I cranked the gravity up. I needed to apply a massive, localized kinetic load to the floor plating to see how the underlying superstructure would react." "And your conclusion?" Olis asked, feeling that cold knot of dread returning. "There is an out-of-phase resonance in your primary load-bearing struts," Danica explained, her tone turning analytical and grim. "Every time my foot hit the deck, the structural rebound was delayed by a fraction of a second. The station is ringing like a cracked bell. Supervisor, something massive is draining power from the structural integrity fields, and it is trying to hide its operational frequency within the ambient noise of the environmental dampeners." Olis scoffed, though her heart pounded. "Our diagnostic systems are top tier. If there was a structural flaw, the automated sensors would have flagged it immediately." "Sensors only see what they are programmed to look for," Danica shot back, her voice tightening with a sudden, raw emotion. 8 years ago, I was stationed on the lunar orbital ring. We kept feeling these tiny, rhythmic shudders in the maintenance shafts. The automated systems said everything was green. The station managers told us it was just thermal expansion from the solar cycles. They told us to ignore it." Danica looked down at her hands. The knuckles were still white from the morning strain. "It was not thermal expansion. It was a microscopic fissure in the primary magnetic containment housing. When it finally snapped, it depressurized 3 entire sectors in 4 seconds. I survived because I was in a reinforced airlock. My older sister was in the main botanical bay. She did not make it. Silence stretched across the cramped office. Olis suddenly felt incredibly small. The human sitting across from her was not an adrenaline junkie. She was a survivor, haunted by the physics of failure, hyper-tuned to the quiet lies that massive machines told before they ripped themselves apart. "Since that day," Danica continued, her voice hardening into steel, "I do not trust the green lights on a monitor. I trust what the metal tells me when I hit it." "And your metal is screaming!" Before Olis could process the weight of that revelation, the office door sensors chimed an angry red override. The heavy door slid open with a violent hiss, revealing a towering, broad-shouldered figure. It was Varric Tharn, the Kroth warrior who had filed the first complaint. His reptilian scales were a mottled gray, and his heavy combat armor scraped against the doorframe. Olis jumped up. "Commander Tharn, you cannot simply breach a restricted office." The Kroth ignored her entirely. His slit-like eyes were locked onto Danica. The warrior did not look angry. He looked profoundly unsettled. "I monitored the internal communications frequency when you were summoned," Varric said, his voice a deep, gravelly rumble that vibrated in Olis's chest. "I needed to know if the human would confess to being a synthetic construct. Instead, I hear her speaking of delayed structural rebounds and hidden frequencies." Varric stepped fully into the room, dwarfing the space. He pointed a massive, clawed finger at Danica. "Describe the rhythm, the exact interval of the delay." Danica did not flinch. She tapped her fingers against the desk. "Tap. 2, 3, shudder." The echo drops by a half octave and drags for 0.4 seconds before snapping back to baseline. Varric's scales paled, turning an ashen gray. He looked at Olis, his usual aggressive bravado completely stripped away. "Supervisor Vey, access the restricted historical archives. Cross-reference that specific oscillation pattern with the deployment logs from the Outer Rim sieges. Specifically, the banned ordnance utilized by the separatist factions." Olis hesitated for a fraction of a second before her hands flew across the holographic terminal. She bypassed the civilian networks, using her emergency override codes to dive deep into the old military registries. She typed in the parameters Danica and Varric had just described. The system buffered for 5 agonizing seconds. Then, the screen flashed a dark, warning magenta. Olis read the classified file, the blood draining from her face. "A localized gravimetric siphon mine," she whispered. "A siege weapon designed to latch onto a station's spine, drain its structural integrity fields, and weaponize the ambient gravity to crush the hull inward." "They were outlawed because they do not trigger standard alarms," Varric growled. "They mask their power draw by mimicking natural operational vibrations. By the time the sensors realize the structural integrity is compromised, the hull is already collapsing." Olis stared at the screen, the pieces of the morning's chaotic puzzle violently slamming together. The bizarre sequence of events was no longer a coincidence. 7 identical complaints filed within 19 seconds. A mass panic orchestrated over a human doing something unusual in a secluded room. "They wanted me distracted," Olis said, her voice barely a breath. "Someone on the station filed those reports to force me to look at you, Lieutenant." "They used your high-gravity run to create a diplomatic circus, ensuring that every security eye and administrative auditor on Aster 9 was focused on the heavy conditioning ring." Danica stood up, her expression lethal. "Because while everyone is busy watching the crazy human, no one is looking down at the cargo spine." The administrative complaint was never about outrage. It was a perfectly timed smokescreen. And beneath their feet, hidden in the dark, restricted bowels of the station, a weapon of mass destruction was silently ticking toward 0. The holographic displays cast a sickly, bruised light across Olisve's office. She had temporarily dismissed the Croth warrior and the human lieutenant to the outer waiting area, needing absolute silence to interrogate the station's mainframe. Her fingers flew across the haptic interface, stripping away the visual graphics to stare directly at the raw code of the 7 formal grievances. Administrative files were supposed to be the bedrock of her reality. They were cold, boring, and undeniably true. But as she dug into the metadata, the files began to whisper a very different story. She isolated the routing protocols. The timestamps pinged back with a chilling synchronization. 7 complaints, originating from 7 different network nodes across Aster 9, all filed within a window of exactly 19 seconds. One node was located in the upper atmospheric promenade. Another was buried down in the hydroponic gardens. It was a physical impossibility for 7 unrelated individuals to witness an event, draft a highly technical legal document, and submit it simultaneously without prior coordination. Olis ran a deep-layer linguistic algorithm over the text blocks. The results blossomed on her screen in bright, warning yellow. The syntax was a lie. The Croth complaint used a culturally appropriate term for muscular honor, but the sentence structure surrounding it was rigid and sterile, completely devoid of the usual guttural dialect markers. The Cillian addendum lacked their mandatory mathematical greetings. The system highlighted the underlying framework of all 7 documents. They were not uniquely authored. They were a single, master-crafted template, fed through a high-tier translation matrix that automatically injected species-specific keywords to create the illusion of diversity. Someone had manufactured a multicultural panic. Before Olis could trace the origin point of the master template, the primary doors to her office slid open, bypassing her privacy locks completely. A tall, painfully angular figure stepped into the room, wearing the pristine, high-collared uniform of a council inspector. Malin Sci did not walk. He glided with an air of absolute, suffocating authority. His eyes were cold, calculating, and fixed entirely on the safety supervisor. "Supervisor Vey," Malin said, his voice as sharp as cut glass. "I understand you are currently managing a multi-species diplomatic crisis. I am here to relieve you of the burden of decision-making." Olis stood up, her jaw tightening. "Inspector Sci, there is no diplomatic crisis. There is a coordinated data manipulation event that I am currently investigating." "Do not insult my intelligence," Malin snapped, stepping up to her desk and dropping a sealed datapad onto the surface. "The rumors have already breached the civilian sectors. The entire station is whispering about the Earth delegation. They are calling the human a peaceful biological weapon. A creature that requires no armored plating, no internal dampeners, yet can withstand crushing physical pressure that would liquefy a standard infantryman. The delegates are terrified. They believe humanity is hiding their true military capacity under the guise of technical support." "She is a technician," Olis argued, her voice rising. "She ran in a high-gravity corridor. That does not make her a biological weapon. It makes her a profound liability to the trade conference," Malin countered smoothly. "I am issuing a council directive. Effective immediately. All physical activities for the human delegation are suspended. They are to be confined to their atmospheric quarters. No heavy lifting, no unauthorized transit, and absolutely no access to the mechanical sectors. We must assure our guests that this station is safe from unpredictable anomalies." The office doors hissed open again, interrupting the inspector's decree. Nato Rill stumbled into the room. His blue skin was practically translucent with panic, and all 4 of his hands were shaking violently. He did not even notice the high-ranking council official standing in the center of the room. "Supervisor," Nato gasped, his mandibles clicking in a frantic rhythm. "The logs. The maintenance logs for the heavy conditioning ring." "What about them, Nato?" Olis asked, a cold weight settling heavily in her stomach. "They are gone," the assistant squeaked. I tried to cross-reference the human's claim about the structural vibrations. I accessed the repair manifests for the corridor. Every single entry for the past 6 days has been completely eradicated. And it was not a system crash. The data was overwritten with a military-grade zero cipher. Someone burned the records to ash. Malin frowned, clearly annoyed by the interruption. A simple administrative error. The archiving system has been temperamental since the solar flares last week. It is not an error, NATO insisted, finally looking at the inspector with wide, terrified eyes. I checked the personnel roster. The data clerk responsible for logging the structural integrity reports of that specific sector submitted an emergency request for medical leave just 1 hour before the 7 complaints were filed. He is gone. His quarters are empty. He took the first transport shuttle out to the lunar colonies. The pieces of the trap locked together in Ulysses' mind with terrifying clarity. The wiped logs, the missing clerk, the synchronized complaints, the sudden arrival of a council inspector demanding the exact person who discovered the anomaly be locked in her room. The bureaucracy was not just lying. It was actively defending the weapon hidden in the station's spine. Lieutenant Danica Rowe pushed her way past the outer doors, having clearly heard the entire exchange. She ignored Malin completely and walked straight up to Ulysses' desk. "I need 6 hours," Danica said, her voice low and tight with absolute urgency. "The structural reverberations are escalating. Whatever that siphon is doing, it is building toward a critical mass. If I can get down into the sublevels beneath the conditioning ring, I can trace the dead zone and find the hardware. But I need to go now." Malin turned on his heel, his face flushing with arrogant fury. "Absolutely not. You are the primary suspect in a station-wide panic. You are restricted to your quarters. Allowing you access to the sublevels would be letting a saboteur tamper with a potential crime scene." "If you lock me in a room," Danica growled, stepping into the inspector's personal space, "this entire station is going to fold in on itself like a crushed tin can. I am not asking for a hall pass. I am telling you how we survive." "I am the council authority here," Malin shouted, his composure finally cracking. "I command the security grid. You will not take one step toward those maintenance shafts." Ulysses looked at the wiped data logs on her screen, then at the inspector, and finally at the human who had weaponized her own heartbeat to find a hidden truth. Ulysses realized she was trapped in a bureaucratic checkmate. If she officially authorized Danica's investigation, Malin would use his override codes to revoke her command and arrest them both. If she agreed with Malin, thousands of people would die in the dark. The safety supervisor took a deep breath. She reached forward and manually disconnected her terminal from the station's primary network. The holographic screens died instantly. "Inspector Sci," Ulysses said, her voice completely devoid of emotion. "It appears my console has suffered a catastrophic network failure." Malin blinked, thrown off balance. "What?" "My system is down," Ulysses repeated flatly. "I cannot process your council directive to restrict the human to her quarters. I also cannot issue a security pass for Lieutenant Rowe to enter the sublevels. Without my terminal, I am effectively blind and administratively paralyzed. It will take me exactly 6 hours to reboot the mainframe and restore my command authorities." She looked directly into Danica's eyes. "During those 6 hours, I have absolutely no way of tracking where anyone is, or what doors might accidentally be pried open. It is a terrible breach of protocol." "I am profoundly ashamed." Danica offered a slow, sharp nod of profound understanding. "A terrible tragedy, Supervisor. I will just go back to my quarters." Carefully, Malin opened his mouth to protest, his face turning a vibrant shade of purple. But Ulysses cut him off. "Inspector, since you are here, I need you to file a manual requisition form for technical support. It is a 400-page physical document. NATO will assist you." As the office devolved into a storm of furious political shouting, The narrative of the station's security grid shifted downward. Far below the polished floors of the executive offices, far below the heavy conditioning ring, where all the attention was currently locked, lay the cargo spine. It was a massive, desolate canyon of reinforced steel and shadowed transit rails. In the absolute darkness beneath the primary load-bearing struts, a microscopic node flared to life. It was not a maintenance light. It was a deep, bloody crimson. A silent, digital heartbeat counting down in the dark, entirely unnoticed by the thousands of souls living above it, because every camera and every eye was busy looking for the human who ran too fast. The air down in the sealed cargo spine tasted of rust and forgotten decades. Aster 9 was a marvel of modern engineering on its upper decks. But down here, in the long-abandoned skeletal structure that held the station together, it was a metallic graveyard. The service elevator had descended for what felt like 15 minutes, leaving the polished political maneuvering of the upper rings far behind. The only illumination came from the flickering glow tubes lining the narrow, claustrophobic maintenance walkways and the small tactical light attached to Danika's shoulder. Olis Vey gripped the cold iron railing, feeling entirely out of her element. She was a creature of data streams and pristine command centers, not a spelunker in a lightless canyon of industrial steel. Behind her, NATO Rill clung to the walkway mesh with all four of his hands. His usually bright blue skin muted to a terrified slate gray in the gloom. They did not just feel the station down here. They heard it. The entire superstructure was vibrating. It was not the steady, reassuring thrum of environmental scrubbers or the rhythmic pulse of fusion reactors. This was a colossal, agonizing symphony of stressed metal. Huge titanium struts groaned like the ribs of a dying leviathan. Every few seconds, a deep, shuddering acoustic wave rolled through the dark, hitting an offbeat that made Olis's teeth ache. It was exactly as Danica had described, a massive instrument playing a catastrophic wrong note. "Stay exactly behind me," Danica whispered, her voice slicing through the heavy, stale air. She stood at the edge of a catwalk that crossed a yawning abyss of intersecting crossbeams. The structural integrity field in this section is completely compromised. The ambient gravity is pooling in invisible pockets. Olis frowned, squinting into the gloom. Pooling. Gravity does not pool. It does when the dampeners are deliberately misaligned, the human replied, never taking her eyes off the metal grating ahead. Listen to the rhythm. The metal shrieks, then it drops. Then there is a half-second of dead silence. That silence is a localized compression zone. If you step into it when the wave hits, the localized mass will jump from zero to something that will snap your femurs like dry twigs. Danica demonstrated. She waited for the massive, groaning reverberation to echo past them, counted 2 rapid breaths, and then broke into a precise, calculated sprint. She did not run in a straight line. She danced across the metal grate, her soft-soled shoes striking the iron exactly on the downbeat of the station's agonizing hum. She leaped over an invisible threshold, just as the air behind her shimmered violently. The ambient dust instantly slammed down against the floor with the force of a hydraulic press. She landed safely on the far side, turning to face them. "You have to run on the note," Danica called out over the grinding ambient noise. "Do not fight the rhythm. Let it tell you where the pressure is going to fall." It took Olis and NATO agonizing minutes to cross the 50-foot expanse, guided by the human's sharp, rhythmic commands. When they finally reached the secure platform, Olis was drenched in cold sweat, her administrative uniform clinging to her back. They pushed through a rusted bulkhead door and found the source of the mechanical agony. Suspended in the center of a massive, hollowed-out junction bay was a machine that had no place on a registered transit hub. It was a chaotic, parasitic tangle of heavy power conduits, cooling pipes, and illegal gravimetric capacitors. It was latched directly onto the primary load-bearing spine of the station like a metallic tick, aggressively draining power from the structural integrity grid. The air around the machine was noticeably warped, bending the weak emergency light into sickening, distorted angles. "By the founders!" Olis breathed, stepping closer despite her instincts, screaming at her to run. "It is a siphon. They are actively bending the load distribution zones, creating sensor blind spots," Danica confirmed, circling the massive apparatus. "If you warp the gravity enough, the automated diagnostics read the area as a dead zone, a void in the architecture. You could hide a fleet of dreadnoughts in the scanner shadow this thing is casting." But the siphon itself was not the most terrifying part. Embedded in the core of the machine, suspended in a containment field of crackling azure energy, was a jagged, crystalline shard. It did not look manufactured. It looked organic, yet carved from the heart of a collapsed star. It pulsed with an inner, terrifying light, vibrating in perfect, destructive harmony with the station's agonizing groans. "I have only seen renderings of that in the restricted historical archives," Elise whispered, completely mesmerized by the deadly artifact. "It is a pre-council relic, a lattice heart shard. They are supposed to be myths, theoretical crystals capable of sympathetic resonance with localized gravitational fields." "It is not a myth, and it is weaponizing your station," Danica said grimly. Neto stepped past them, his mandibles clicking in rapid, uncontrolled terror. He was not looking at the artifact. He was looking at the telemetry readouts on the siphon's crude physical interface. He traced the power draw lines, projecting the vector of the gravitational distortion upward through the station's schematics. "Supervisor," Neto choked out, falling to his knees. "The vector projection. If this containment field destabilizes, or if the siphon demands more power than the spine can provide, the backlash will not hit the executive levels. The structural snap will travel straight up the tertiary struts. It will hit the lower cargo rings." Olis felt her blood turn to ice. The lower cargo rings were not automated storage. They were the high-density residential sectors for the station's working-class population. "Neto," she said softly, "your family's habitation block. They will be the first to crush inward," the assistant confirmed, burying his face in his hands. "Tens of thousands of people. Gone in less than a second." Danica moved away from the machine, her tactical light sweeping across the shadowy corners of the junction bay. "They are not just using this to cause a disaster. Look over there." Stacked against the far wall, partially obscured by the warped light of the blind spot, were dozens of heavy, unmarked transit crates. They lacked any official customs seals or barcode registries. Danica pried the lid off the nearest crate with a discarded hydrospanner. Inside, nestled in shock-absorbent foam, lay row after row of high-yield plasma disruptors and heavy kinetic shielding generators. Strictly banned military hardware. A smuggling operation, Olis realized, the sheer audacity of the crime leaving her breathless. Someone is moving black market war technology through Aster 9. They are using the lattice heart to create a massive, undetectable pocket in the station's inventory grid. The siphon hides the cargo, and the diverted gravity allows them to move thousands of tons of illegal weapons without triggering the mass balance alarms. Suddenly, the heavy bulkhead door they had just passed through slammed shut with a deafening, metallic crash. The heavy locking mechanisms engaged with a series of heavy thuds. Above them, the ambient light strip snapped from a dim, sickly yellow to a harsh, aggressive crimson. 3 heavy enforcement drones dropped from concealed ceiling alcoves, their visual sensors burning a bright, hostile red. The mechanical whine of their targeting gimbals spooling up filled the bay. "We triggered a localized proximity ward," Danica shouted, diving behind a stack of smuggled weapon crates as the first drone opened fire. Searing bolts of plasma scorched the air where she had been standing a microsecond before. "The network controller knows we are here," Olis yelled over the deafening roar of weapons fire, dragging NATO behind a thick, titanium support pillar. "They locked the sector down. They are switching the drones from patrol to lethal enforcement." Danica peeked out from behind the crates, analyzing the chaotic crossfire. The drones were not just shooting, they were herding them, forcing them toward the center of the bay, where the gravity siphon was warping the air into a localized maelstrom. The hum of the machine grew louder, the lattice heart pulsing aggressively as it fed on the sudden surge of kinetic energy in the room. "The manual override for the bulkhead is on the far wall," Danica called out. "But the floor between here and there is caught in the siphon's backwash. The gravity is oscillating between 0 and something that will flatten a tank." "I have the master override key on my datapad," Olis shouted back, clutching the heavy device to her chest. "But I cannot make that run." "I do not know the rhythm." Danica did not hesitate. "Throw it to me. If you drop it, we are dead," Olis warned. "Throw it!" Olis blindly hurled the heavy datapad across the open gap. Danica snatched it out of the air with violent precision. The human took one deep, ragged breath, closed her eyes for a fraction of a second to listen to the agonizing groan of the station's spine, and then bolted from cover. It was a terrifying display of biological calculation. Danica threw herself into the warped air just as a drone fired. The plasma bolt sailed over her head, bending upward due to the erratic gravitational shear. She hit the ground, but she did not fall. She slid, using a sudden patch of zero gravity to propel herself forward, before violently slamming her boots down exactly as the downward force spiked, using the crushing weight to launch herself toward the bulkhead. She was moving through an invisible, lethal obstacle course, dodging heavy plasma fire while mentally calculating the deadly tidal forces of the siphon. She slammed into the far wall, her shoulder hitting the metal with a sickening crunch. Ignoring the impact, she jammed Olis's datapad into the manual port and slammed her palm onto the release switch. The red lights blinked green. The heavy doors hissed open. Olis grabbed NATO and dragged him through the opening, just as Danica laid down a volley of covering fire from a scavenged disruptor rifle. The human backed out through the door, hitting the emergency seal behind them. The thick metal slammed shut, cutting off the drone fire and trapping the horrific hum of the lattice heart inside the junction bay. Olis leaned against the cold wall of the escape corridor, her chest heaving as she stared at the human. Danica was bruised, covered in industrial grease, and favoring her left shoulder, yet her eyes were completely calm. She was already looking down the next dark corridor, mapping the route back to the surface. In that shadowy, suffocating hallway, a profound shift occurred within the safety supervisor. All the bureaucratic annoyance, the xenophobic rumors, and the administrative panic melted away. Olis finally understood. The human was not a reckless anomaly who had brought disaster to her station. Danica Rowe was the only living creature fast enough, tough enough, and observant enough to run straight into the teeth of a catastrophe and read the warning signs before the trap snapped shut. The observation deck overlooking the heavy conditioning ring was packed shoulder to shoulder, a sea of vibrant alien garments, polished armor, and nervous energy. To prevent mass panic ahead of the Intergalactic Trade Conference, Olis had officially classified the morning's terrifying incident as a misunderstood cultural display. Now, under the glaring station lights, it was billed as a sanctioned public assessment of human biological capabilities. The alien dignitaries, merchants, and scholars, initially terrified by the formal grievances, had returned with the morbid curiosity of aristocrats attending a gladiatorial circus. The air in the gallery was thick with the scent of synthesized perfumes, ozone, and condescension. Behind the reinforced polyglass, Olis stood at a temporary command console, projecting the image of a transparent administrator. In reality, her eyes were completely detached from the spectacle. She was tracking the station's localized power grids, hunting for the ghost in the machine. By making the event public and high-profile, she and Danica were setting a trap. Whoever was manipulating the gravity siphon down in the cargo spine would be forced to adjust the blind spot to hide the massive energy draw of the conditioning ring. When the saboteur altered the frequency to compensate, Ulyss would trace the signal right back to their terminal. The heavy blast doors inside the testing chamber hissed open. Danica Rowe stepped into the harsh yellow warning light. A collective murmur of disbelief and scorn rippled through the audience. Without an exosuit or localized anti-gravity harness, the human looked absurdly fragile. The gravity dials pushed up, locking in at 5 times the standard constant. Danica did not launch into her steady, metronomic rhythm from the previous session. She broke the beat entirely. She sprinted for 10 rapid paces, halted abruptly, driving her heels into the deck with concussive force, and then launched into a jagged, syncopated jog. She was actively fighting the harmonic resonance of the station. By throwing her immense relative weight against the structural weak points at unpredictable intervals, she was forcing the hidden siphon below to aggressively compensate. The ambient hum of the chamber turned into a desperate, grinding whine that only those listening closely could catch. Varric Tharn pushed his way to the very front of the observation gallery. The massive Kroth warrior slammed his armored fist against the polyglass, his reptilian face contorted in anger. He thought the human was mocking the seriousness of the situation, putting on a chaotic performance rather than demonstrating true martial endurance. Danica locked eyes with the towering alien without breaking her erratic stride. She pointed a finger directly at a load-bearing seam on his side of the glass, then held up 3 fingers, counting down with sharp, deliberate nods. 3, 2, 1. Driven by an instinct he could not quite articulate, Varric pressed his bare, scaled palm against the metal frame exactly on her final cue. His slit eyes widened in absolute horror. Right beneath his hand, he felt the terrifying, delayed, structural rebound. It was the sickening, offbeat echo of the banned gravity weapon he remembered from the Outer Rim sieges. He looked at Danica, his jaw slack, the scorn completely vanishing from his posture. He finally understood that the human was not performing a parlor trick. She was using her own bones to break the camouflage of an invisible machine that was slowly killing them all. Down in the dark, the saboteur panicked. Danica's erratic kinetic spikes pushed the siphon too hard, forcing a catastrophic overcompensation. The automated dampeners in the observation deck shrieked a deafening warning. The gravity index above the crowd spiked violently, tearing past safe parameters. The primary observation shield slammed down from the ceiling, but jammed halfway, screeching against warped tracks. Above the tightly packed, aristocratic crowd, a massive titanium auxiliary beam snapped under the sudden shear force. The metal groaned like a dying beast as it tore free from the ceiling, angling directly toward the panicked spectators. Absolute chaos erupted. Fragile diplomats scrambled over one another, crushing silk robes and delicate appendages against the jammed exit doors. Inside the chamber, Danica recognized the shifting tidal wave of pressure. She abandoned her test run entirely, slamming her fist against the emergency acoustic amplifier on the wall. Her voice boomed over the screaming crowd, sharp and commanding. "Do not run! Move on the downbeat!" she roared, her eyes tracking the invisible waves of misaligned gravity tearing through the room. She became a conductor of survival. "Hold steady! Now step back! Move on the silence!" She coordinated the crowd's frantic movements, guiding them through the localized compression zones before the invisible weight could crush their spines. Varric did not flee toward the exits. The Kroth warrior stepped directly under the collapsing titanium beam. As the gravity wave receded for a fraction of a second, he reached up and caught the massive structure on his broad, armored shoulders. He roared in pure agony as the next wave of pressure hit, the sheer tonnage threatening to snap his legs. But he held the line. He stopped fighting the weight blindly and began using Danica's shouted timing, bracing his massive muscles exactly when the localized pressure spiked, acting as a living pillar to protect the fragile scholars cowering beneath him. Amidst the screaming and the grinding metal, Olis kept her hands flying across her terminal, desperately trying to lock onto the signal spike. But her peripheral vision caught Inspector Malin Sci. The council official had signaled his personal guards to move toward the reinforced exits a full 10 seconds before the beam cracked. He had anticipated a localized structural failure. He had been waiting for it. But as the entire observation deck continued to shudder wildly, threatening to tear itself apart completely, Malin's smug anticipation shattered into raw, unadulterated terror. He fell to his knees, clutching the railing, his face pale and sweating. In that frantic moment, Olis realized the horrifying truth. The inspector was involved, but he was merely a pawn. He knew about the hidden siphon. Perhaps he even sanctioned the smuggling operation it was hiding. But he clearly had no idea the machine was currently rigged to cause a catastrophic, station-wide collapse. He was just as betrayed, just as expendable to the true mastermind as the rest of them. Suddenly, the primary power grid automatically tripped a massive safety breaker. The localized gravity reset to a harsh but survivable baseline, with a heavy, concussive thud. Varric hurled the broken beam aside, collapsing to one knee, panting heavily as his armor hissed with released pressure. The crowd was a tangled, weeping mess of bruised bodies and torn finery, but they were alive. Inside the testing corridor, the crushing weight finally lifted. Danica limped slowly toward the polyglass barrier, her chest heaving, her athletic gear soaked in sweat. She placed her bruised hand flat against the transparent surface. Olis abandoned her console and stepped forward, meeting the human on the other side of the glass. Danica leaned her forehead against the cool barrier, her eyes dark and burning with a terrifying realization. Her voice came through the local communications channel, barely more than a harsh, ragged whisper. The person who set this up is not just watching us. He is tuning the station's rhythm to my every footstep. Olis's fingers flew across the damaged auxiliary console. The localized power spike Danica had forced from the hidden siphon left a microscopic data trail, a fleeting shadow in the network's architecture. Olis chased it, ripping through layers of encrypted firewalls. She expected the trace to lead directly to Inspector Malin Sci's secure quarters. Instead, the digital blood trail bypassed the council subroutines entirely, diving deep into the station's oldest, most heavily fortified foundational code. The access key belonged to the logistics manifest matrix. A name materialized on the screen, glowing in a cold, unforgiving blue. Saville Core. Olis stopped breathing. Saville was the veteran quartermaster of Aster 9. He was the stoic, grandfatherly figure who had served on the station for over 3 decades. The man who brought her imported tea when the supply lines backed up, the anchor of calm in every bureaucratic storm. He possessed absolute, unquestioned access to every blind spot, cargo container, and maintenance schedule on the massive hub. "It is Saville," Olis whispered, the sense of profound betrayal turning her stomach to ice. For years, he has been using the localized gravity disruptions to forge blank spaces in the transit logs. He is the one moving the black market wartech. The artifact in the spine is his engine, and he has been running a shadow port right under our feet. The pieces of the elaborate puzzle snapped together with horrifying clarity. The 7 synchronized grievances were a brilliantly engineered piece of misdirection. Saville needed every security camera, every safety protocol, and every administrative eye looking at the human who dared to run under crushing pressure. The manufactured outrage ensured no one would look down into the cargo spine exactly when the siphon needed to draw its maximum power to move a massive, illegal shipment out of the sector. Nearby, the observation deck was still a scene of panicked recovery. Varric Tharn, his heavy armor dented from catching the falling titanium beam, limped toward Danica. The towering Kroth warrior did not look aggressive. He looked utterly exhausted. "I did not file that report out of spite. Human," Varric grumbled, his voice lacking its usual thunder. During the siege of the Outer Rim, my unit was caught in a gravimetric minefield. I watched 200 of my brothers compressed into ash in a fraction of a second. When I saw you stepping precisely on those structural delay nodes, my blood froze. I thought you were activating a resonant weapon. The complaint was not hatred. It was terror. Danica offered a slow, understanding nod. You recognize the rhythm of a slaughter. I would have filed a report too. NATO Rill scrambled up to Olis, his datapad blinking frantically. Supervisor, security forces just located the missing archive clerk. He is alive. He was locked inside a secondary climate-controlled data vault near the hydroponics sector. He confessed everything. Saville forced him to wipe the maintenance records, threatening to destroy his career and have his entire family exiled to the barren asteroid mining colonies if he refused. Olis turned her fierce gaze upon Malin Sci. The council inspector was sitting on a shattered bench, holding his head in his hands. He looked nothing like the arrogant official who had demanded Danica's arrest hours earlier. You knew, Olis stated, her voice sharp enough to cut titanium. You did not know about the smuggling ring or the bomb, but you knew what was powering it. Malin looked up, his face ashen. The council detected faint, anomalous gravitational echoes from Aster 9 5 years ago. They suspected a lattice heart shard was buried somewhere in the ancient superstructure, but they refused to order a formal excavation. If the galaxy found out a pre-council artifact of that magnitude existed here, it would have sparked a sovereign war over control of the station. So, they ordered me to keep the sector quiet. I thought Saville was just helping me bury the bureaucratic anomalies. I had no idea he was plugging the artifact into a weaponized siphon to cover his own treason. He used your political cowardice to build a bomb, Danica said coldly. Olis spun back to the console, her fingers moving frantically to initiate an immediate command override and lock Saville out of the main grid. But she was too late. Saville had watched the observation deck disaster unfold. He knew his cover was blown. The console screamed. A blood-red emergency notification flooded every screen, holophone, and display across the entire transit hub. Warning! The automated station intelligence announced, its synthesized voice echoing through the damaged gallery. Catastrophic core destabilization imminent. Station-wide emergency lockdown initiated. All transit rings are now severing. Massive, multi-ton blast doors slammed shut across the station, locking off the residential rings, the commercial promenade, and the docking bays. The grinding roar of metal echoed through the deck as Aster 9 literally began to cut itself into isolated, airtight segments. Saville had weaponized the safety protocols. He was trapping security forces and pushing the central core into a fatal overload, ensuring the station would consume itself and bury all evidence of his crimes before he made his escape. Olis punched her command codes into the terminal, but the system rejected them. Saville had infected the primary network. He held the master keys. Diplomacy, standard operating procedures, and council authority were completely dead. They were locked in a dying cage. The siphon is drawing too much, Danica yelled over the rising mechanical shrieks. The artifact is resonating out of control. If the main core fractures, the containment fields will fail, and the localized gravity will crush the station into a singularity. How do we stop it? Olis demanded, her bureaucratic mind racing to find a loophole in physics. We cannot hack the network, and the drones will be crushed instantly if they enter the fluctuating gravity zones, Danica replied, pulling a heavy physical schematic up on a scavenged datapad. She pointed to 3 distinct nodes located along the station's deep infrastructural routes. We have to manually reset the 3 primary anchor pylons. If we physically sever the physical data links at these 3 junctions, the core will forcefully reboot, cutting the power to Saville's siphon. Varric peered over her shoulder, his eyes narrowing at the schematic. Those pylons are located inside the main arterial shafts. The gravity shear down there is currently fluctuating so violently that machines cannot function. Danica looked at the Croth warrior, then at Ulyss, her jaw set with terrifying resolve. Machines cannot adapt to a broken rhythm. They only know math, but organic bodies can feel the music. The entire station shuddered violently, throwing them all against the railing. Aster 9 was dying, tearing its own skeletal structure apart. There were no overrides left. There was only flesh, bone, and a suicidal run into the heart of a gravitational storm. The shattered remnants of the observation deck vibrated with a terrifying, rhythmic intensity, mirroring the catastrophic heartbeat of the dying transit hub. The emergency lighting cast long, frantic shadows across the faces of the unlikely survivors gathered around Danica Rowe. She had forcefully ripped a tactical display panel from the jammed security console, hot wiring it to project a jagged, flickering three-dimensional map of the station's deepest foundational roots. "We have to manually reactivate these 3 anchor pylons," Danica stated, her voice slicing through the cacophony of groaning titanium and wailing alarms. She pointed to 3 glowing red nodes spaced aggressively far apart along the primary arterial shafts. And they must be triggered in an exact, cascading sequence. Pylon 1, then Pylon 2, and finally the central core chamber. If we miss a beat, or if we trigger them out of order, the gravimetric feedback loop will instantly tear the core apart from the inside out. Varric Tharn leaned his massive, armored bulk over the projection, his reptilian eyes tracking the proposed route. Those arterial shafts are located directly above the siphon's localized blast radius. The ambient gravity down there is no longer governed by the station's environmental dampeners. "It is completely unhinged," Danica confirmed, her expression grim. "The telemetry shows the environmental zones fluctuating wildly. We are looking at corridors that will throw you into near-zero gravity, then slam you down with up to 7 times standard pull a few seconds later. A mechanized exosuit is useless down there. It will tear its own hydraulic servos apart trying to compensate for the rapid, unpredictable shifts. A security drone will be crushed completely flat before it travels 10 meters. Inspector HFY Sci wiped a streak of soot from his pristine council collar, looking utterly out of his depth. "If machines cannot survive the shear force, how can flesh and bone?" "Because we do not have to fight the entire path alone," Danica replied, her gaze sweeping over the group. "No single species possesses the biological capability to survive that entire gauntlet. A human cannot bash through a jammed bulkhead under that kind of pressure. A Croth is too massive to navigate the secondary maintenance bypasses, but together we form a perfect chain." She tapped the first node on the map. "Varric. The physical pressure doors leading into the arterial shafts are deadlocked by Savel's lockdown protocols. The localized gravity will make those doors weigh tons. I need you to pry them open and hold the line against the shear force so we can cross the threshold." The Croth warrior did not hesitate. He slammed a heavy fist against his chest plate, the dented metal ringing out. He had spent his life seeking glory and conquest, but as he looked at the terrified faces of the scholars he had just shielded, he found a deeper, more profound honor. "The doors will not close while I draw breath." Danica traced a microscopic path on the hologram. "NATO. The main corridor to the second pylon has already collapsed. The only way through is the capillary maintenance tubes. They bypass the main crush zones, but they are less than a meter wide and filled with exposed wiring." NATO Rill trembled, his blue skin pale with terror, but he stepped forward, his 4 hands clenching into fists. "I can compress my skeletal structure. It will be agonizing, but I can fit through the tubes and reach the manual relay." Danica turned to the council official. "Malin, Saville has layered the physical relays with black site council encryptions. If we reach the pylons and cannot bypass the digital locks, we die in the dark. I need you stationed at the secondary network junction. You have to strip the high-level security codes live as we run, clearing the digital path ahead of us." Malin looked at his trembling hands. By using his master clearance to hack his own government's black site protocols, he was effectively ending his political career and making himself a highly visible accessory to the station's darkest secrets. He looked at Ulyss, then at the human, and finally found his spine. "I will keep the digital doors open. You just focus on the running. And I will carry the sovereign key," Ulyss Vey finished, pulling a heavy, intricately carved metallic cylinder from her administrative belt. "The final core chamber will only accept a physical override from the station's acting commander. Saville locked the digital network, but he cannot forge my biometric signature." A heavy, oppressive silence fell over the group, punctuated only by the distant, agonizing shrieks of tearing metal. They were a shattered collection of bureaucrats, diplomats, and soldiers, staring down a suicide mission. "Why do you do it?" Ulyss asked suddenly, the question escaping her lips before she could stop it. She looked at the human, noting the dark bruises forming on her arms, the sheer exhaustion masked by iron willpower. "Why push your body to the absolute breaking point in those heavy conditioning rooms?" I watched the footage. "It is not just physical training. It is punishment." Danica looked away from the holographic map, her eyes darkening with the shadows of an old, deep trauma. During the lunar orbital ring collapse, I did not just lose my older sister. I lost my nerve. When the first bulkhead breached and the alarm screamed, I froze. Absolute panic locked my muscles. I survived because I was physically thrown into a reinforced airlock by the decompression wave. Not because I fought back. She looked back at Ulyss, her voice dropping to a fierce, raw whisper. "I promised myself I would never let my mind betray my body again. I train under crushing weight until the pain simply becomes muscle memory. I run until my lungs burn, so that when the terror hits, my legs are already moving before my brain can tell them to stop. I run to outpace the fear." Ulyss felt a sharp, profound ache in her chest. The human's brutal confession mirrored her own deeply hidden shame. "My entire career," the supervisor admitted softly, the polished veneer of her authority finally cracking, "has been built on the illusion of absolute control. I worship stability. I buried every anomaly in endless paperwork because actively investigating them meant acknowledging the presence of risk. That obsession with safety almost made me ignore the warning signs that are currently tearing Aster 9 apart. My fear of chaos built the perfect, quiet blind spot for a saboteur." The two women shared a look of absolute understanding. They were both running from past failures, and their paths had violently intersected at the edge of the abyss. "We do not try to be each other," Danica said, her voice rising, injecting steel into the trembling air. She looked at the unlikely squad. "A human cannot hold a blast door against 7 times standard gravity. A Croth cannot navigate a ventilation capillary. A safety supervisor cannot outrun a gravimetric wave. We do not need heroes. We just need everyone to push past their own limits, right exactly where their biology fits best." Suddenly, the overhead speakers crackled to life, cutting through the emotional weight of the room. The automated station intelligence delivered its final, icy verdict, completely devoid of empathy or hope. "Critical warning. Core phase break is irreversible in 23 minutes. Evacuation protocols have failed. May the Founders guide your path." 23 minutes until the colossal transit hub became a tightly compressed tomb of shattered metal and vaporized flesh. Danica turned toward the heavy blast doors leading down into the dark, violently vibrating corridors. Beyond the threshold, the station was howling, a dying iron beast trapped in its own snare, thrashing wildly in the dark. The journey ahead was a nightmare of crushing pressure and weightless freefall. "Let's go catch a ghost," Danica said. They moved as one, launching themselves into the chaotic, syncopated rhythm of destruction, knowing with terrifying certainty that if a single one of them missed a beat, there would be no one left alive to tell the tale. The corridor leading to the primary anchor pylon was an absolute meat grinder. The station's violent shuddering caused the main compression door to slam downward in jagged, unpredictable bursts, acting like a colossal titanium guillotine. Varric Tharn threw his massive, armored frame underneath the descending block just as it began its final, lethal drop. The impact drove the Kroth warrior to his knees, with a sickening crunch. The reinforced metal shrieked as his combat armor buckled, his thick muscles bulging under a localized weight designed to crush industrial transport shuttles. He roared, thick blood trickling from his reptilian jaws, refusing to yield an inch. Danica shot past him, diving directly into the fluctuating gravity zone. The air around her shimmered, bending the emergency lights into sickly halos. It hit her instantly, 6 times standard planetary pull. Her vision tunneled into a dark pinpoint. Every blood vessel in her eyes threatened to burst under the sudden, staggering atmospheric pressure. She did not sprint. Sprinting was impossible. She forced her legs into a brutal, agonizing march, her soft-soled shoes slamming against the deck with concussive force. It was a battle against a solid wall of kinetic energy. Reaching the terminal, her fingers left bloody smears on the keys as she hammered in the bypass sequence. A green flare ignited in the dark. Pylon 1 was online. Simultaneously, in the makeshift command hub they had established near the secondary junction, Olis watched a station-wide broadcast hijack the emergency civilian channels. Savile Cor's face did not appear. Instead, a forged, highly classified dossier flooded every screen on Aster 9. The fake intelligence report detailed a fabricated narrative. The Earth delegation's reckless biological flexing had accidentally awakened a dormant alien artifact, and the human was entirely to blame for the impending destruction. For a fraction of a second, Olis felt the familiar, deeply ingrained urge to engage the administrative blackout protocols. Her old instincts screamed at her to suppress the panic, lock down the communication grid, and maintain a facade of order. But the safety supervisor who worshipped stability was dead. She slammed her hand onto the master broadcast switch, bypassing the blackout completely. Instead of hiding the truth, she weaponized it. Olis opened every public channel, flooding the civilian networks with raw, unfiltered reality. She live-streamed Danica's biometric feed, showing her heart rate redlining in the gravity zones. She broadcast the security feed of Varric, holding the collapsing door with his bare hands. She dumped the decrypted logs of Savile's black market shipments and the erased maintenance files directly into the public domain. She laid the corruption bare for the entire galaxy to see. That single decision split the dying transit hub down the middle. In the lower residential sectors, panic boiled over. But in the engineering bays, the academic rings, and the merchant promenades, a profound shift occurred. The alien dignitaries and workers realized they were not just victims trapped in a cage. They were witnessing a desperate fight for their lives. Data streams began flooding back to Olis's terminal. A team of Volaris merchants remotely rerouted auxiliary power from their private vaults to stabilize the life support systems in the lower spine. A cadre of Cillian scholars began calculating the erratic gravitational waves in real time, feeding the safe navigational paths directly to Danica's headset. The rescue team was no longer alone. The station was fighting alongside them, far below the command hub. NATO Rill squeezed his multi-limbed body into a capillary maintenance tube, no wider than his own shoulders. The ambient heat was blistering, smelling of melting copper and scorched dust. The metal walls pulsed with misaligned gravity, threatening to flatten him into a smear of blue blood at any moment. He hyperventilated, fighting the crushing, suffocating claustrophobia. Ahead of him, 3 heavily encrypted security mesh layers blocked the physical control line for the second pylon. "Inspector!" NATO gasped over the comms, his voice trembling. "I am at the firewall." In the shattered junction room, Malin Sci stared at his council-issued datapad. Bypassing these specific black site encryptions remotely required burning his own biometric signature into the council's permanent treason registry. It meant the absolute end of his political career. his elite status, and his freedom. He would be hunted as a rogue agent. He remembered the terrified faces of the diplomats he had sworn to protect, and he thought of the raw courage of the human who ran forward to save them while he had cowered in the observation deck. The inspector offered a genuine, bitter smile of absolute liberation. He initiated the sequence, willingly burning his own digital identity to ash. The firewalls in NATO's claustrophobic tube sparked and died in a shower of blue sparks. NATO jammed the manual relay home. Pylon 2 locked into place. The surviving members converged on the central core chamber. The heavy blast doors had been torn open by the sheer magnetic force radiating from within. In the center of the massive, cavernous room, suspended directly above the churning, unstable fusion reactor, Savile Kor stood on a reinforced metal catwalk. He held a portable containment unit, housing the lattice heart. The ancient artifact was screaming, its sympathetic resonance tearing a localized spatial portal open. A crude, highly unstable slipstream, just large enough for one person, and a hard drive packed with decades of smuggled data. Savile looked down at the battered rescue team, his grandfatherly face twisted into a mask of cold, calculating arrogance. He did not look panicked. He looked utterly triumphant. "You are too late, Supervisor." His voice echoed over the deafening roar of the dying reactor. "The phase break is locked, but I must admit, I am genuinely impressed you made it this far. I gave you the perfect villain, did I not?" He pointed a steady finger directly at Danica. "That formal complaint about a human running in 5 times standard gravity was my masterpiece. The galaxy is always so incredibly eager to be terrified of something extraordinary. It is so much easier to fear a phantom biological weapon, to rally against an unknown physical anomaly, than to look down and see the mundane, everyday corruption rotting beneath your own feet. You chased the terrifying shadow while I quietly emptied the vault." Savile turned his back on them, preparing to step into the unstable slipstream. Before Olis could raise her scavenged weapon to fire, the central core suffered a massive, catastrophic misfire. The gravitational dampeners inside the chamber completely inverted. The localized field spiked erratically, jumping past any parameter they had encountered in the corridors. The automated blast shield separating the entrance from the catwalk slammed downward, a failsafe attempting to seal the volatile reactor from the rest of the station. Olis dove forward, but the invisible wave of kinetic pressure threw her backward violently. The thick, polyglass shield crashed into the deck, locking Olis, Varric, NATO, and Malin on the safe side of the observation threshold. But Danica was already moving. Driven by the pure instinct she had forged in the conditioning rings, she had slipped under the descending shield a fraction of a second before it locked into the floor. She was trapped inside the core chamber with Savile and the overloading reactor. The biometric scanners on Olis's terminal screamed in a continuous, high-pitched warning. The gravity inside the chamber was no longer oscillating between highs and lows. It was compounding in a lethal, unbroken upward cycle. 6 times, 7 times, 8 times standard planetary pull. Savile was instantly pinned to the metal grating near his escape portal, unable to lift his own head or move his arms under the crushing, suffocating weight. The manual reset lever for the final anchor pylon was situated at the far end of the catwalk, exactly 60 meters away from Danica. Under 8 times standard gravity, a human skeleton should instantly shatter. Internal organs should rupture. The air itself became a physical ocean of heavy, suffocating pressure. Danica Rose stood at the edge of the catwalk, dark blood pouring freely from her nose, her muscles locked in agonizing, visible spasms beneath her skin. She stared down the impossible distance, standing before a final, brutal run that absolutely no living creature in the galaxy had the right to believe she could finish. Savile Kor lay pinned against the reinforced grating of the core chamber, his chest barely rising under the suffocating weight. Yet, despite his physical paralysis, his eyes gleamed with absolute, mathematical certainty. He knew the parameters of organic endurance. He knew the agonizing math of the localized gravitational field. The distance between the trapped human and the manual reset console was 60 meters. To cross that expanse under a constant, crushing pull of 8 times the standard planetary gravity was a biological impossibility. The human heart would simply lack the kinetic force to pump blood to the brain. She would pass out after 3 steps and die of internal hemorrhaging by the 5th. Saville was perfectly content to wait out the final seconds. Behind the jammed polyglass shield, Ulysse Vey refused to watch the human die in silence. Her administrative terminal was critically damaged, sparking from the power surges. But the broadcast array was still functional. She did not just send a distress beacon. She dumped the entire, unredacted truth into the station-wide network. Every data pad, every holographic billboard, every emergency comlink on the transit hub suddenly flashed with the final chain of evidence. Ulysse broadcast the master template of the forged grievances, the erased maintenance logs, the exact schematics of the illegal siphon, and finally, the true name and face of the mastermind orchestrating their execution. The response was instantaneous, and it came from the very species that Saville had manipulated into filing the original complaints. They did not succumb to the panic he had so carefully engineered. Instead, they fought back. Across the failing sectors, the Croth warriors abandoned their evacuation posts, using their immense bulk to physically brace the buckling load-bearing struts, buying the core chamber precious microseconds of stability. In the academic rings, the crystalline Cillian scholars linked their cognitive processors into a single, massive computational matrix. They analyzed the chaotic, fluctuating frequencies of the gravity storm and beamed the safe rhythmic pathways directly into Danika's headset. The Valeris merchants, notoriously greedy, manually severed the power feeds to their own life support modules, redirecting every spare volt of energy down to the core dampeners to soften the crushing pressure by a fraction of a percent. The Osk ascetic monks took over the localized communication channels, projecting a calm, resonant frequency that cut through the chaotic shrieking of alarms and panicked voices. Danica Rowe heard the station rally behind her. She did not have to conquer the impossible weight alone. She just had to run to the rhythm they were building for her. She took her first step. The air was a physical barrier, thick as wet concrete. Her muscles tore, and the capillaries in her arms burst, painting her pale skin in a violent, bruised mosaic. The gravity spiked to 5 times the standard pull. She moved with the heavy, calculated grace of a deep-sea diver, planting her soft-soled shoes precisely on the structural nodes the Cillian scholars were projecting into her ear. Left, right, hold. The station groaned, and she shifted her weight, riding the kinetic wave rather than fighting it blindly. The dial surged to 7 times normal gravity. The pressure forced the air from her lungs in a sharp, bloody mist. Every instinct screamed at her to drop, to curl into a ball and let the darkness take her. But she remembered the terror of the lunar ring collapse. She remembered freezing. She let that old, cold fear burn into pure, kinetic fury. She pushed her body beyond the breaking point, syncing her heartbeat with the pulsing, desperate hum of the 40,000 souls fighting alongside her. Then, the core misfired again, and the localized field peaked at a sustained 8 times standard pull. Danica's knee buckled. The femur cracked under the immense strain, and she slammed face first onto the metal grating. A collective gasp echoed across the station-wide comms. Saville managed a ragged, bloody sneer. The math had won. The biology had failed. But the human did not stay down. Spitting a mouthful of blood onto the deck, Danica planted her palms against the iron floor. She did not rely on brute, irrational human strength. She waited for the microscopic dip in the gravity cycle that the scholars had promised. 2 seconds. 1 second. Now. She threw her entire mass forward, using the rebounding kinetic energy of the floor to launch herself into a brutal, sliding tackle. She glided across the final 5 meters, her body tearing across the grating, and slammed into the base of the manual reset console, just as the system countdown hit its final cycle. "Now!" Danica screamed, her voice a raw, ragged tear in the heavy air. Outside the chamber, the chain of command fired in perfect synchronicity. Malin Sci smashed the final digital firewall, his council authority clearing the path, deep in the capillary tubes. NATO Rill jammed the physical phase return line into its socket, his blue hands scorched and bleeding. At the primary doors, Varric Tharn gave one final, deafening roar, his muscles tearing as he held the structural integrity node open. And behind the polyglass, Olis Vey initiated the biometric pulse, sending her sovereign administrative key directly to the console Danica was clutching. Danica reached up, her arm shaking violently under the crushing weight, and pulled the heavy manual reset lever all the way down. The entire transit hub went completely, terrifyingly silent for 1 full second. Then, the gravity dampeners snapped back to a standard baseline. The massive, illegal siphon bolted to the station's spine powered down with a dying, mechanical whine. The lattice-hard artifact, stripped of its parasitic energy feed, dimmed into a dull, inert stone. Savile Core's escape slipstream destabilized instantly. The portal violently collapsed inward, generating a massive kinetic shockwave that picked the quartermaster up and slammed him brutally against the reactor shielding. He crumpled to the floor, coughing up blood, alive, but completely broken. Security drones breached the chamber seconds later, locking heavy magnetic cuffs onto his wrists, right on the very floor he had intended to vaporize. In the weeks that followed the disaster, the galactic political landscape shifted dramatically. The Council inspectors arrived in droves, but they did not come to arrest the Earth delegation. They could no longer classify the events in the heavy conditioning ring as a psychological incident caused by a reckless human. It was officially recorded as the first tactical warning that saved over 40,000 lives on Aster 9. The human capacity to endure, to read the hidden flaws in the metal, was no longer a terrifying anomaly. It was a highly sought-after survival trait. Sitting in her newly reconstructed office, Olis Vey drafted the final incident report. She typed out the exact subject line that had started the entire terrifying ordeal. They saw a human running in 5 times gravity and filed a complaint, but she did not send it to the disciplinary committee. She changed the administrative classification from a formal grievance to the foundational document of a new, station-wide emergency protocol. The paperwork was no longer a lie used to hide the rot. It was a blueprint for survival. The artificial dawn cycle initiated over the central promenade, casting a warm, golden light across the polished metal corridors. Olis stood before the heavy blast doors of the conditioning ring. She was not wearing her pristine, high-collared safety supervisor uniform. She wore simple, dark athletic fabric and soft-soled running shoes. The doors hissed open. Danica Rowe stood in the harsh, yellow warning light. A medical brace secured tightly around her left knee, but her eyes were just as sharp and focused as the first day they met. Olis stepped over the threshold. The gravity dials pushed upward, pressing a heavy, invisible weight onto her shoulders. It was terrifying, uncomfortable, and entirely out of her control. She looked at the human, offering a small, determined nod. They were not there to judge the limits of biology, nor were they there to hide from the fear of the unknown. They were there to test the metal, to feel the rhythm of the station, and to start running. Thank you all so much for listening to the conclusion of this story. I would love to know where you are listening from, so please drop a comment below to share your location and your thoughts on how the crew of Aster 9 handled the crisis. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to the Sci-fi Stories channel, leave a like on the video, and support us even more by hitting that hype button so this story can be heard by many more people out there in the galaxy.